This video will take you through the key features about the Nazi war economy using the notes from the lesson that we did recently. Okay, so need to just quickly take you through the key features of the actual conflict of World War II, which underpins the topic of the war economy. This first map shows you the war in Europe, 1939 to 1941. The key points shown on the left there, the key events. I'm not going to take you through all of the sort of detailed events there. What obviously you need to understand is that, sort of just zooming in here, if we look at Germany, shaded in yellow there, obviously before World War II broke out, and World War II broke out on at the beginning of September 1939, Czechoslovakia and Austria had already been absorbed into Germany. Austria was Anschlussed in 1938 and Czechoslovakia in two stages, in October 38 and then in March 1939. And Hitler was able to do that without actually Germany having to go to war. Remember, he did not want a war with Britain. Hitler's objectives lay to the east. But then on the 1st of September 1939, Germany attacked Poland to secure the Polish corridor, the area that split Germany. You can see there East Prussia in 1919. As a result of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had been divided into two. Hitler did not want and was not expecting Britain to declare war on Germany for that when he attacked Poland. He'd got away with it before with Austria and Czechoslovakia, but he did miscalculate. And as a result of that, on the 3rd of September, Britain declared war on Germany, which was the start of World War II, which was frustrating to Hitler because it meant he needed to deal with the British threat before he could then focus on the east, which is where his true objectives lay. And to deal with the British threat, he basically had to take out territories that surrounded Britain before launching his attack on Britain. Now, Albert Speer, remember, talks about this as kind of like start-stop wars, which sort of sums it up nicely. The key point is that Germany waited. There was no fighting. There was what we call the phony war. So Poland was defeated very quickly in September of 1939, and then there were several months in which there was actually no fighting. Germany was building up its resources, and then suddenly in April 1940 launched a blitzkrieg attack on France and the Low Countries, Belgium and Holland, so shown there, and then similar tactics taking Denmark and taking Norway, which effectively, looking at the map here, meant that the seaboard area was controlled by Germany. And so then in the summer of 1940, Germany launched its air attacks on Britain, the Battle of Britain, and that obviously failed. Britain held off, and Hitler called off the attack. At that point, Britain was alone. You look at the map, clearly Germany dominated the whole of Europe, and so Hitler, confident that he could now just turn his attention eastwards to his true objectives, Hitler made the decision in the original planned date was in May, the middle of May 1941, to launch his big attack eastwards to take the Soviet Union. Fatal error. The attack was delayed by 6 weeks so that Hitler could help Mussolini, who had attacked Greece. So Germany attacked Yugoslavia so that they could provide support for Italy in the war against Greece. That campaign was successful, but it did postpone the invasion of Russia that was eventually launched on the 22nd of June 1941. An enormously successful attack. On one level, Blitzkrieg again steamrolled into Russia, almost achieved its objective of taking Moscow, but the autumn rains and then the severe winter ground the German attack ground to a halt just outside Moscow in December 1941, and Hitler made his next fatal error at that stage. He declared war on America. So everything that Hitler had been trying to avoid, although it looked as if Germany had now won the war virtually, actually by the end of 1941, in a sense, Germany had already lost that war. It would take nearly 4 more years before Germany was defeated, but Germany was basically caught in a two-front war situation because to the east, the Soviet Union had not been defeated. Over the course of the winter of 1941 to 2, the Soviet Union was able to rebuild its infrastructure far to the east beyond the Ural Mountains, and of course in the west Britain had not been defeated. America was brought into the war, and over the next two years American troops supplied Britain with America supplied Britain with troops and equipment, and then of course in 1944 they launched their invasion from the west. So moving on to the next map, shows the second phase of the war, and effectively Germany was forced into the retreat. So the middle part of the war, as we move into 1942, it was a year in which there was very little movement. The fronts were held, but Germany was her supply lines were severely stretched. Actually, if you think how far she'd advanced into the Soviet Union, supplying her soldiers was very difficult. There was that key battle, the key turning point battle, the Battle of Stalingrad. And then as we move into 1943-44, Germany was in full retreat from the east. And then, of course, Germany was, the Americans and the British launched their invasion from Britain, the D-Day invasions of 1944, and then Germany was in retreat from the west and also from the south, because the Americans launched an invasion through the soft underbelly of Europe, using Africa as a launch pad, attacking Germany's ally, Italy, through the soft underbelly of Europe and pushing up from the south. So Germany was in full retreat, and pretty much it was it was known that Germany would lose the war. But as early as 1943, it was just a question of how long it would take before Germany surrendered. And the key difference between World War II and World War One is that, of course, Hitler never surrendered, and there was no collapse of morale on the home front in the same way as in World War One. So the regime continued to fight until the bitter end, and only when in April 1945 the Russians had advanced into Germany from the east and the British and the Americans advanced into Germany from the west, they literally met in the middle of Germany, and Hitler killed himself. Did the war actually end? So those are the key features of the actual war. So those are the sort of elements of the lesson of the war economy. So the first area we looked at was the issue of partial mobilisation and lack of readiness for total war. Now, I'm not going to take you through bullet point by bullet point the way I did in the lesson. You can just simply pause the video, read these questions, and you can then play the video. I'll just sort of highlight the key points as we go as we go through this. Okay, so you saw the three questions there. I've highlighted on the slide here approximately the points in the notes where the answers to those questions are given. The key points, taking the first sort of question, why was the Nazi economic policy becoming unsustainable in the long term by 1939? The point there is that the economy was trying to be both. It was trying to be, using the very famous phrase, be both guns and butter. What that basically means is the economy was trying to produce weapons to prepare for war, but it was also trying to keep the consumers, the German people, happy. And there was Hitler's main problem. Is that unlike, for example, Britain, when World War II began, the British fully understood, and Churchill made a very clear statement that we're going to have to make sacrifices, that the economy cannot sustain both consumer goods and weaponry during a time of war. In Germany, Hitler was extremely reluctant for the economy not to provide the basic consumer needs of the people. And so in the preparation for war with the 4-year plan that began in 1936, the economy was in effect overheating. Wages were capped. Hitler did not want to create an inflationary spiral, but the balance of payment situation was getting worse and worse, and there is an argument by historians that although the economy would not be ready to launch an eastward invasion until the mid-1940s, because of this building pressure, and in particular there's a lot of evidence as we move into 1939 that the German working classes were grumbling, that they were unhappy with their capped wages and the lack of consumer goods in the shops, that Hitler, so sensitive to his own popularity, and remember, dictatorship is not based just on terror, it is based primarily on consent, on popularity. And Hitler, therefore, was under pressure to resolve that, and the way out of that situation was to launch his eastward invasion earlier than he actually originally planned. And that's one of the interpretations. So with that in mind, therefore, Hitler launched the invasion of Poland in September 1939. It was an astonishingly successful invasion. Blitzkrieg tactics were used. So the key thing was a short, sharp surprise attack, a massive air bombardment, taking the Poles by surprise, throwing everything at Poland, followed by the land invasion using the tanks, and then securing Poland. Poland was defeated in 6 weeks. So Blitzkrieg was based on the concept of stockpiling weapons and a short, sharp surprise attack on a local front. It's one country at a time. And then once you've defeated the country, as happened, but by the end of September 1939, Poland was pretty much defeated, you then need a period of peace, where Germany can then refocus its economy on building up more weapons. And in the meantime, the conquered country can be plundered, its wealth, its assets can be absorbed into the German economy as a way of relieving that pressure on the people. Now, to some extent, it seemed as if this was working with Poland, because Poland was defeated, the assets were absorbed. Hitler's downward decline in popularity before the outbreak of World War II was reboosted. A new level to the myth was established. Hitler, the great military leader. Remember, the German people did not want war with Britain, and although Germany was now at war with Britain, Britain clearly wasn't ready to fight Germany. And there was still a great deal of hope by this point that Britain would pull out of the war. So you've then got a few months period of rest before Hitler then did exactly the same, and a blitzkrieg attack against France and the Low Countries, then Denmark, then Norway. Short, start, stop wars, and after each one, a plunder economy, plundering the wealth of those conquered countries. Okay, so that's the partial mobilisation and lack of readiness for total war. Moving on to the next slide, which is the impact of Hitler's style of leadership. Oh, sorry. Military victories, whilst only partially prepared. Take a look at those three questions, and then just you can pause the video while you look at those questions. Okay, so again, the answers are pretty much highlighted there in the notes. The first question, summarise Germany's military successes, 1939 to 41. I've just done that. So Poland, then the Low Countries and France, then Denmark, and then Norway. All 1939 to 40. And then, of course, the attack on Britain. And that was not a success. The same tactics were used, blitzkrieg tactics against Britain. What made Britain different, of course, was that Britain was an island. So although the same tactic of an aerial invasion, of an air attack was launched in the summer of 1940, obviously built into that was the follow-up land invasion had to go by boat. But it never happened because the air attack was called off after the so-called Battle of Britain. So the second question, if Germany was only partially prepared for war, why was she militarily so successful from September 1939? In part, it was because of the tactic of blitzkrieg, remember, which was stockpiling weapons and then fighting in an intense short campaign. So Germany was not militarily prepared for a long war on a big fighting front against several countries at the same time. But in terms of one country at a time, it obviously worked. There's also a big argument that if Britain had been better prepared and if Britain had anticipated the attacks, that the blitzkrieg tactics might not have worked. There's a very convincing argument in Adam Tooze's book, The Wages of Destruction, for example, about how Germany's blitzkrieg attack on France was very, very dependent on literally using 2 or 3 roads for the movement of troops. And that if the British had anticipated and had known the route of the invasion of France, that the invasion of France would have probably have collapsed. So to answer that question, why was Germany militarily so successful? It was partly Germany's tactics, but it was also luck. It was also the weaknesses of the opposition, or the mistakes of the opposition, in particular Britain, that were a factor. And the third question, why did Germany's lack of preparedness become evidence from late 1941 onwards? Well, that's obviously because Germany attacked the Soviet Union. It seemed to be a huge success, but remember that 6-week delay was absolutely crucial, because if the attack had been launched on the original date, the middle of May, it's quite likely that Germany would have taken the Russian capital, Moscow. But that 6-week delay basically meant that the weather, the autumn rain and the winter, then worked against the German attack, and they were not able to take Moscow, which allowed the Soviet Union to rebuild over that particular winter. And the point is that Germany was caught in a situation where she was now fighting a total war. Total war means a huge fighting front. The fighting front against Russia was 3,000 miles long from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And then add to that, Britain had not been defeated, so Hitler had to maintain troops in the west, because there was the risk at any point that Britain might launch that invasion across the English Channel, opening up a second front in the west. Now, that didn't happen until 1944, but Hitler didn't know that. He had to maintain troops in the west as well. The other important thing is that the attack in the east had stretched Germany's supply lines. Literally, the German soldiers are so far away from Germany that actually supplying them with the food, the materials, the weapons to continue fighting the war was an almost impossible task, not least because the Russians in retreat had followed a scorched earth policy, sort of like tearing up railway lines, burning their own farms, so that Germany could not plunder the Russian economy the same way that she had plundered the economies of the other countries that she had defeated. So that hopefully answers the third question. Moving on then to the next slide. This is about Hitler's style of leadership. Pause the video and read the questions. Okay, so the key points here. That lack of economic preparedness, how was it an outcome of his own personality? A couple of points here. The first point, just going again, it's on the notes that you're looking at there. But the first point is as we've already done these lessons about Hitler's style of leadership, and obviously one of the key things is his lack of efficiency. Hitler distanced himself from making key decisions, and that did result in a lot of lack of coordination, and that was one of the major problems of the war economy at the beginning of World War II. In spite of the fact that Germany was winning the war, and think about the map, Germany effectively conquered much of Europe in between 1939 and 1941. That was in spite of economic strength rather than because of it. That when the war was going well, the economy was being managed very, very inefficiently. There was conflict, there was lack of cohesion. The army, the navy, and the air force were fighting it out amongst themselves for vital resources. Decisions were not being made. Whole factories were sitting there not producing because of the lack of coordination. And that, to a large extent, came out of Hitler's leadership because he did not give a strong, clear direction. The other point, which is very much from the source, so just going to the actual source itself, lots of key points in here. Albert Speer wrote his memoirs called Inside the Third Reich, published in 1970 there. And just highlighted some of the key points from that particular extract of his memoirs. And this is where he talks about Hitler's chronic reluctance to make economic decisions that will damage his own personal popularity. So unlike Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, who right from the word go was very, very clear, made sort of key decisions that we've got to introduce rationing, we've got to conscript women to work in the factories. Hitler, waging this war of a plunder economy, steered clear of making those sorts of decisions. So things like conscription of women into factories didn't happen until 1943. Likewise, rationing was not fully introduced. It was only introduced gradually, whereas Churchill in Britain introduced these potentially unpopular measures right at the beginning of the war. But Churchill was able to do that because he was very honest and open to the British people, and the British people rallied behind Churchill in Britain. There was no decline to the morale in Britain, whereas in Germany, Hitler was so afraid of the low morale that he was not prepared to make those damaging decisions. So the economy continued to try to produce consumer goods even at the height of the war. Again, that's part of lack of efficiency. Remember, when you talk about this in the exam, it all comes down to Hitler's experience in World War I. Okay, that the reason Germany lost World War I, central to it, was the decline of the morale on the home front, and Hitler was therefore so sensitive to making those unpopular decisions. So those are the sort of key points for that particular slide. Moving on to the next one. The economic policies of Fritz Todt and Albert Speer. So those are the questions. Pause the video while you read the questions. And again, here we have the notes and the answers. Okay, so the key point here is that, as I said earlier, the beginning of the war, when the war was being fought well, when Germany was winning the war, the irony is the economy was badly managed. You've then got a flip situation in the second half of the war. From 1943 onwards, Germany, well, from 1942 onwards, really, the war effectively was lost. And certainly from 1943, Germany was retreating on all fronts. And yet, during the second phase of the war, the economy was much more efficient. So, a very sort of ironic situation. When the war was being lost, the economy was being well run. When the war was being won, the economy was badly run. Now, part of that sort of like shift towards efficiency in the second half of the war, or a big part of it, was to do with the fact that two key men sort of stepped in and brought about greater efficiency. The first was called Fritz Todt, who was appointed Minister of Armaments in 1940. And undoubtedly, he did a lot to introduce efficiency. And the details are there. I don't need to read them through, but make sure you learn those details. He was able to, one of the key reasons that there was inefficiency is that there was this huge organisation, the four-year plan organisation run by Hermann Goering, that had been preparing the war economy in a very, very inefficient way. And remember, the four-year plan organisation was working on the basis that the war wouldn't start until the mid-1940s. What Todt basically did, his distinctive contribution, is he gave industry greater control in terms of the running of the economy. He started to bring in key business leaders, whereas under Goering, decisions were being made, economic decisions were being made by basically soldiers. They were being made by the leaders of the army, the air force and the navy, and they weren't working in coordination either. They were being very selfish for their own particular needs. Todt was killed in a plane crash in February 1942. And he was replaced by Albert Speer, who's a very interesting character. Speer was Hitler's personal architect. Remember, Hitler had originally, before he entered politics, had been an artist. Hitler, beneath it, was always fascinated by architecture and art, which is why he had a close relationship with Albert Speer. And Albert Speer had always had access to Hitler, a young Nazi, and suddenly he had no knowledge of economic matters, but he was suddenly given the job to take over from Todt in February 1942. And Speer's initial reaction was, well, I know nothing about economies. But the point about Speer was he was an absolute brilliant organizer, and he was a very, very incisive leader. And there's no doubt about it, over the next 2 years, Speer made the war economy much more efficient. Again, the details are there on the slide about central planning, allocation of raw materials, incredible measures to reduce wastage, just sort of like incisively cutting through sort of like inefficiency. And again, you've got statistics there about increased efficiency, lots and lots of statistics, resulting in weapons production increasing by 130% at a time when Germany was losing the war, which again shows how effective he was. But the third question, why by 1945 was Speer struggling to maintain his personal power, was, again, he kind of fell victim to the nature of Nazi politics, which, of course, Hitler's distancing himself from the capital and ruthless, ambitious Nazis competing against each other, the sort of social Darwinistic aspect of Nazism, and Speer fell victim to powerful, ambitious other Nazis. So he was struggling, particularly in the last year of the war, to maintain his control over the war economy because other Nazis wanted to take over, wanted to interfere in the war economy. So that leads to the final slide about the radicalisation of the regime. So you got Speer in the bottom right-hand corner there. The three key Nazis who then put forward their own claim to run the economy for personal selfish reasons are shown. Top left is Martin Bormann, who was the head of the party chancellery. Top right is Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister. And then bottom left is Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS. And in particular, the fact in 1944 he was the SS. Himmler himself was put in charge of the Home Army for the defence of Germany as Germany retreated back onto her own soil. There are the key points. You might just want to pause the video and read through those points before I sort of take you through the key messages. So the first question: why was the 20th of July 1944 a turning point in the running of the war economy? That was the date, 20th of July, that there was an attempt on Hitler's life. Almost succeeded. The bomb plot, the very famous bomb plot, it failed. The perpetrators were arrested and shot, and from that point onwards, Hitler was absolutely convinced that there were we've done this sort of story about the party versus state, and the fact that the state had not been fully taken over by the party out of deliberate choice because of its expertise. Well, this sort of now accelerated the process of the party taking over the state because as a response to the fact Hitler saw enemies everywhere in the state, he felt he could no longer trust the leading state officials, many of whom were not Nazis and who were conservatives. So Hitler's response was the party needed to now take over the key aspects of the state. Now, what that did is effectively is it produced a big, it elevated key Nazis to muscle in on the running of the war economy, because the war economy was still being largely managed by leading state officials. So Goebbels was the first one. He was appointed plenipotentiary for total war. Note the date, 5 days after the bomb plot on Hitler. Why Goebbels? Goebbels was in charge of propaganda, controlling the mood of the people, or sort of mobilizing the people to fight to the very end, mobilizing the home front. Obviously, propaganda had to play an important part in that. So Goebbels started shutting down industries that were producing non-essential items, mobilized the German workforce, work leave was banned, employment of domestic servants was restricted, which freed up more women to be employed for war production. But as you can see there with point 6, those policies had little impact. At the same time, Hitler gave increased powers to Himmler. Himmler was appointed commander-in-chief of the army for this final phase of the war. And back on the home front, Martin Bormann, the head of the party's administration, took advantage of this final phase of radicalisation, where the party was being allowed to take over the state, to increase the powers of the Gauleiters. Now, the Gauleiters were the regional Nazis who ran their particular area, who were in charge of their particular area of Germany. They had been back in 1933. They had been given the job of Reich governors. But up until this point, that they had been held off being allowed to take to manage the economy. But as a result of this radicalisation, the Gauleiters now started to basically take control over the economies of their area, which did not work because it lacked any form of central coordination. Power became decentralised. The Reich started to fragment. So the Gauleiters would hoard workers, for example, in their own particular region. They would not allow workers to move from their region to another region of Germany, which therefore undermined the work that Speer was doing to increase efficiency. At the same time, as the war is now really turning against Germany, retreat on all fronts, you have to remember there were devastating Allied bombing raids nightly on Germany from 1943 onwards. So in spite of all the efficiencies that Speer was introducing, it was the odds were stacked against him, partly because of internal problems to do with these ambitious Nazis that were working against his own planning, but secondly, the Allies, the Americans and the British, launching their bombing campaigns. In spite of all of that, these ambitious Nazis, Himmler, Goering, Goebbels, and Bormann, did stay loyal to Hitler. They never ever attempted to seize power for themselves, which is the final point there. Okay, so that's the end of this video. I hope that was useful to you. Thank you.